Welcome to Eternal Darkness, where nightmares come to life. I'll be your host through these twisted tales tonight. Before we descend into the shadows, remember to like and subscribe to join our growing community of horror enthusiasts. Get comfortable, turn down the lights, and prepare yourself as we begin our journey into the unknown. The hike up the Rocky Mountains was brutal, but none of us minded. We were too caught up in the excitement of being out here, miles away from civilization, just four friends and the untamed wilderness. The air carried the sharp scent of pine and something else, something wild and ancient that made my pulse quicken with anticipation. I glanced over at Brandon, who wore the biggest grin I'd ever seen, his eyes sparkling like those of someone who'd just discovered buried treasure. We all felt it. That intoxicating rush of freedom that only comes when you've left the modern world far behind. Casey took the lead as always, his experienced eyes scanning the trail ahead, pointing out elk tracks pressed deep into the mud and sharing stories about the massive black bears that roamed these peaks. His knowledge of the wilderness was encyclopedic, gained through decades of hunting and hiking in these very mountains. When we finally established our camp as the sun began its descent behind the jagged peaks, the sky erupted in brilliant shades of amber and crimson. The temperature dropped rapidly, but our fire caught quickly, sending sparks dancing upward into the gathering darkness. Soon we were lost in conversation, roasting hot dogs and sharing stories that grew more embellished with each telling. The night felt infinite and protective, as if we existed in a bubble of warmth and light surrounded by the vast darkness of the wilderness. I could hear the fire crackling hungrily, consuming the dry timber we'd gathered, and the wind whispered secrets through the towering pines that surrounded our clearing. In the distance, the haunting calls of coyotes echoed across the valley, a reminder that we were visitors in their domain. Everything felt perfectly balanced. Four friends, unlimited wilderness, and the promise of adventure stretching out before us like an unwritten book. But as the darkness deepened around our small circle of light, something changed. The comfortable sounds of the wilderness began to fade, replaced by an oppressive quiet that seemed to press against my eardrums. Then, cutting through that unnatural silence like a blade, came a sound that made every muscle in my body tense. It was a low, rumbling growl that seemed to originate from somewhere deep in the black spaces between the trees. The sound was unlike anything I'd encountered before, too deep for a coyote, too threatening for an elk, and carrying an undertone of pure aggression that made my skin crawl with primitive fear. Brandon's head snapped up from the fire, his expression shifting from relaxed contentment to sharp alertness in an instant. "Did you hear that?" he whispered, his voice barely audible above the crackling flames. Marcus tried to laugh it off, but I caught the slight tremor in his voice when he said, "Probably just a bear checking us out. They're curious about the fire." But his eyes kept darting toward the tree line, and I noticed his hand had unconsciously moved closer to the bear spray clipped to his belt. The growl came again, closer this time, and with it came something that made my blood feel like ice water in my veins. It wasn't just the sound itself, it was the intelligence behind it. This wasn't the random vocalization of a wild animal going about its business. This was deliberate, calculated, as if something was testing us, measuring our reactions. Casey's weathered face had gone pale in the firelight. He'd spent more time in these mountains than the rest of us combined, and if he was worried, we should all be terrified. "That's not a bear," he said quietly, his voice carrying absolute certainty. "Bears don't sound like that." The fire suddenly seemed inadequate against the pressing darkness. Every shadow beyond our small circle could be hiding something with teeth and claws and intentions we couldn't fathom. The comforting sounds of the wilderness remained absent, as if every living thing in the forest was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. We retreated to our tents that night, but rest was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, that menacing growl echoed in my memory. and every small sound from outside made me bolt upright with my heart hammering against my ribs. The thin nylon walls of my tent felt like tissue paper against whatever had made that sound. I lay there in my sleeping bag, staring at the fabric ceiling and listening to the others shifting restlessly in their own tents. Occasionally, someone would clear their throat or adjust their position, and I knew I wasn't the only one lying awake, afraid to let down my guard even for a moment. Around 3 in the morning, I heard footsteps outside. Heavy, deliberate footsteps that circled our camp with methodical precision. I wanted to call out, to wake the others, but terror had locked my voice in my throat. The footsteps stopped directly outside my tent, and I could hear something breathing. Deep, slow breaths that seemed to go on forever. Then, just as suddenly as it had arrived, the presence moved on. The footsteps continued their circuit around our camp before fading back into the forest. I remained frozen in my sleeping bag until dawn, afraid to move, afraid to breathe too loudly, afraid that any sound might bring that thing back. When morning finally arrived, we emerged from our tents haggard and hollow-eyed. None of us had gotten any real rest, and the strain showed on every face. We barely spoke as we prepared breakfast, each of us lost in our own thoughts and fears about what we'd experienced. As Casey prepared to douse the remains of our fire, Brandon called out from the edge of our campsite. His voice was tight with fear and disbelief. "You need to see this," he said, pointing at the ground near his feet. We gathered around him and stared at what he discovered. Pressed deep into the soft earth were footprints unlike anything I'd ever seen. They were enormous, easily twice the size of Marcus's size 12 boots, and the depth suggested something far heavier than any of us. But it was the shape that made my stomach turn. They were almost human in configuration, but elongated and distorted, with what appeared to be claw marks extending beyond where toes should be. The prints formed a complete circle around our campsite, confirming what I'd heard during the night. Something had indeed walked around our tents while we lay terrified and helpless inside. The spacing between the prints suggested a creature with an impossibly long stride, something that could cover ground with frightening efficiency. Casey knelt beside one of the prints, his face grave. He was a man who'd tracked everything from deer to mountain lions, but this clearly disturbed him. "I've never seen anything like this," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "The size, the depth. Whatever made these had to weigh at least 400 pounds, maybe more." Marcus crouched down beside another print, his hands shaking as he held them up for comparison. The print dwarfed his hands completely. "This can't be real," he muttered. But the evidence was right there in the dirt, undeniable and terrifying. We made the decision to pack up immediately. Whatever had visited us in the night clearly viewed us as prey, and staying in the same area would be suicidal. As we broke down our camp with frantic efficiency, I kept glancing at the tree line, expecting to see something massive and hostile emerge from the shadows. The hike back toward the trailhead should have been straightforward. We'd covered this same ground just 2 days earlier, but everything felt different now. The forest seemed darker, more menacing, and the trail that had been so clear on our way up now seemed to twist and branch in confusing directions. Worse still, we weren't alone. Throughout the morning, we caught glimpses of something moving parallel to our route, staying just out of clear sight but close enough to let us know it was there. Branches would snap in the distance, or a shadow would flicker between the trees, always at the edge of our vision. Brandon kept looking over his shoulder, his face pale with fear. "It's following us," he said, stating what we all knew but didn't want to acknowledge. "It's been tracking us for hours." The realization that we were being hunted by something intelligent and patient was almost too much to bear. This wasn't a chance encounter with a wild animal. This was deliberate stalking by a predator that understood our weaknesses and limitations. By midday, the psychological pressure had become unbearable. Every step felt like it might be our last. Every sound from the forest made us jump and spin around. searching for threats that remained just out of sight. Our pursuer was playing with us, letting us know it was there, but never revealing itself completely. Casey tried to maintain some semblance of leadership, but I could see the fear in his eyes. His decades of wilderness experience hadn't prepared him for this. "We need to keep moving," he said, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. "If we can reach the truck before dark." He didn't finish the sentence. We all understood what would happen if we were caught in the open after sunset. As afternoon faded into evening, our stalker became bolder. The sounds of its movement grew closer and more frequent, and occasionally we caught clearer glimpses of something massive moving through the trees. It was staying just beyond rifle range, but its presence was a constant reminder that we were completely outmatched. When we stopped for a brief rest, Marcus made a discovery that confirmed our worst fears. Fresh prints in the muddy bank of a small stream showed that our pursuer had crossed ahead of us at some point. It wasn't just following, it was herding us, driving us in a specific direction for reasons we couldn't understand. "It's trying to cut us off from the trail," Casey realized, his voice heavy with dread. "It knows where we're going, and it's getting there first." The tactical implications were terrifying. We were dealing with something that understood strategy and planning, something that could think several moves ahead. It had turned the forest into a chessboard, and we were just pawns being maneuvered into position for capture. As the sun sank lower, we abandoned any pretense of an orderly retreat. We were running now, crashing through underbrush and scrambling over fallen logs with desperate energy. Behind us, we could hear our pursuer matching our pace effortlessly, the sound of its movement growing steadily closer. My lungs burned and my legs felt like rubber, but pure terror kept me moving. Every breath was a struggle, every step a monumental effort, but stopping meant death. The forest blurred past us as we fled, branches tearing at our clothes and faces as we fought our way through the undergrowth. Just as full darkness was about to claim the forest, we stumbled into a small clearing where we'd planned to make our final camp before reaching the trailhead. But our pursuer had anticipated this move. As we burst from the tree line, exhausted and gasping, we found ourselves face to face with our nightmare. It stood at the far edge of the clearing, and in that moment, all our worst fears were confirmed. The creature was massive, easily 8 feet tall, and built like a nightmare fusion of man and beast. Its body was covered in dark, matted fur, and its eyes reflected our flashlight beams with an intelligence that was somehow more terrifying than any mindless animal aggression. For a long moment, neither we nor the creature moved. It studied us with those unnaturally intelligent eyes, and I had the horrible feeling that it was deciding which of us to take first. The silence stretched on, broken only by our ragged breathing and the pounding of my heart. Then Marcus made a fatal mistake. He raised his rifle, and the creature's demeanor changed instantly from watchful patience to explosive violence. It let out a roar that seemed to shake the very ground beneath our feet, a sound filled with such primal fury that my entire body went numb with terror. What happened next occurred too fast for my mind to fully process. The creature moved with impossible speed for something so large, covering the distance between us in 3 massive bounds. Brandon screamed, a sound I'll hear in my nightmares for the rest of my life, as enormous claws wrapped around his torso and lifted him off the ground. The last thing I saw of my friend was his face, twisted in agony and terror, as he disappeared into the darkness beyond the clearing. His screams echoed through the forest for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds, growing fainter and more desperate before finally cutting off with horrible suddenness. The 3 of us who remained stood frozen in shock for precious seconds that almost cost us our lives. Then Casey grabbed my arm and shouted something I couldn't hear over the blood roaring in my ears, and we ran. We ran harder than I'd ever run in my life, crashing through the forest in blind panic, guided only by Casey's flickering flashlight and the desperate need to put distance between us and that monster. Branches slashed at my face and thorns tore at my clothes, but I felt none of it. My entire world had narrowed to the simple act of putting one foot in front of the other, of keeping up with the others, of staying alive for just one more minute. Behind us, I could hear the creature pursuing, but whether it was toying with us or actually trying to catch us, I couldn't tell. We ran through the night, stopping only when exhaustion forced us to, then pushing on again when terror overcame fatigue. Sometime before dawn, we stumbled onto the main trail, and by full daylight, we could see our truck in the parking area below. The sight of that battered pickup sitting in the morning sunlight was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. We stumbled down the final stretch of trail like zombies, our energy completely spent, but driven on by the promise of escape. Casey fumbled with the keys while Marcus and I kept watch on the tree line, expecting our pursuer to emerge at any moment for one final attack. The engine turned over on the first try, a miracle I credited to God's mercy, and we were moving before all the doors were completely closed. I kept looking back as we drove away, expecting to see that massive form emerge from the forest, but the woods remained still and silent. We drove in complete silence for the first hour, each of us lost in our own thoughts and trauma. When we finally did speak, it was only to agree that no one would believe what we'd experienced. Brandon's disappearance would be reported as a hiking accident, and the truth would remain our secret burden. But sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, I still hear that roar echoing across the years. And I know that somewhere in those dark mountains, something that shouldn't exist is still watching, still waiting for the next group of unsuspecting hikers to venture too far from the safety of civilization. The wilderness keeps its secrets, and some of those secrets have teeth. The summer of 2018 should have been like any other. I was 21, fresh off my third year studying theater at Manchester, and desperate for the familiar comfort of our annual camping tradition. The five of us had kept this ritual alive since our Duke of Edinburgh days, that peculiarly British program that throws teenagers into the wilderness and expects them to emerge as functioning adults. I remember the exact moment everything started to go wrong. It was a Thursday evening when we gathered at Cheggers Flat, the air thick with anticipation and the smell of cheap lager. Cheggers, whose real name was Benedict, but who'd earned his nickname after a particularly embarrassing incident involving breakfast cereal and too much vodka, was meticulously checking his camping gear. His engineering background meant everything had to be perfect. Every tent peg accounted for. Every gas canister weighed. Powell sat in the corner, his massive frame taking up most of the sofa. Despite his intimidating size, 6'4" and built like a professional athlete, he was oddly quiet that night. His usual boisterous energy seemed dampened, and he kept checking his phone with an expression I couldn't quite read. Later, I'd understand why. Sammy and Brody arrived together, as always. They'd been inseparable since secondary school, Sammy with his wild curls and infectious laugh, Brody perpetually buried in whatever obscure philosophy book he'd discovered that week. They brought with them 3 cases of beer and enough meat to feed a small army, our standard supplies for a week in the wilderness. Right then, Cheggers announced, spreading an ordnance survey map across his coffee table. Same spot as always? The spot in question was a secluded patch of forest in the Yorkshire Dales, miles from the nearest village. We'd discovered it 2 years prior, completely by accident when Cheggers had taken a wrong turn trying to find a designated campsite. Instead, we'd found paradise, a natural clearing surrounded by ancient oaks, with a stream running nearby and not a soul in sight. Actually, Powell spoke up, his voice strangely tight. Maybe we should try somewhere new this year. We all turned to stare at him. Powell never suggested changes to our plans. He was a creature of habit, finding comfort in routine. Why? Brody asked, looking up from his book, something about existentialism that made my head hurt just reading the cover. Powell shrugged, but I noticed his jaw clench. Just thought it might be good to explore somewhere different. Nonsense, Cheggers said, folding the map with practiced precision. Our spot is perfect, private, beautiful, and we've already built that fire pit. Be ashamed to waste it. The discussion was over. When Cheggers made a decision, it usually stuck. Powell said nothing more, but I caught him staring at the map with an expression that, in retrospect, looked almost like dread. Friday morning arrived gray and drizzling, typical Yorkshire weather that we'd learned to embrace rather than endure. Cheggers' Volvo estate was packed to the brim, 5 lads' worth of gear crammed into every available space. I claimed the middle back seat, sandwiched between Sammy and Brody, while Powell rode shotgun, his long legs barely fitting even with the seat pushed all the way back. The drive north took 3 hours, winding through increasingly narrow roads as we left civilization behind. The radio signal faded somewhere near Skipton, leaving us with only Brody's questionable music collection for entertainment. Powell remained unusually quiet, staring out the window at the passing moorland. "You all right, mate?" I asked, leaning forward to tap his shoulder. He turned, and for a moment I saw something in his eyes. Fear? Anxiety? But then he smiled, that familiar Powell grin that could light up a room. "Yeah, just thinking about me training schedule. Coach wants me running 10 miles a day when I get back." It was a lie. I knew Powell well enough to recognize when he was deflecting, but I didn't push. If something was bothering him, he'd tell us when he was ready. That was our way. No pressure, no judgment. The final stretch of road was barely more than a dirt track, Cheggers' Volvo bouncing over potholes and struggling through muddy patches. The trees closed in around us, their branches scraping against the roof like skeletal fingers. The sound set my teeth on edge, though I couldn't say why. "Getting proper Blair Witch vibes here," Sammy joked, but his laugh sounded forced. We reached the small gravel car park, really just a widened bit of track, around 2 in the afternoon. It was empty as always. That was part of the appeal. This place was so far off the beaten path that even dedicated hikers rarely found it. The hike to our clearing took another 40 minutes, following a barely visible path through dense undergrowth. We'd done it enough times that muscle memory took over, my feet finding familiar roots and rocks even as my mind wandered. The forest was unusually quiet. No birdsong, no rustle of small animals in the underbrush. Just our own breathing and the crunch of leaves beneath our boots. When we finally emerged into our clearing, I felt the familiar rush of homecoming. It looked exactly as we'd left it the previous summer. The circle of stones we'd arranged for our fire pit. The flat area perfect for pitching tents. The stream gurgling cheerfully nearby. But something felt different. Wrong. Somehow. "Is it just me?" Brody said slowly. "Or does it feel like someone's been here?" He was right. The fire pit looked recently used, though no ashes remained. The grass where we usually pitched our tents was flattened in unfamiliar patterns. And there was a smell, faint but unmistakable, of smoke and something else. Something organic and unpleasant. "Probably just hikers passing through," Cheggers said. But he was frowning as he surveyed our campsite. "Come on, let's get set up before it starts raining again." We fell into our familiar routine. Cheggers directing tent placement with military precision, Powell gathering firewood, Sammy and Brody arguing about the optimal barbecue setup, and me trying to help everyone while mostly getting in the way. By evening, our camp looked like home. 5 tents arranged in a semicircle around the fire pit, camp chairs set up, coolers strategically placed. The first night was perfect. We grilled steaks over the fire, drank beer, and told the same stories we'd been telling for years. Powell seemed to relax as darkness fell, even joining in when Sammy started an impromptu sing-along of terrible 90s pop songs. The forest around us came alive with nocturnal sounds. Owls hooting, foxes screaming in the distance, the rustle of night creatures going about their business. I remember thinking, as I crawled into my tent sometime after midnight, that I'd been silly to feel uneasy earlier. This was our place, our tradition, Nothing could spoil it. I woke to the sound of voices. For a moment, disoriented and hungover, I thought one of the lads was talking in his sleep. But the voices were coming from outside, unfamiliar, and getting closer. I checked my phone, 7:23 a.m. Too early for any of us to be voluntarily awake. Unzipping my tent, I peered out to see two figures entering our clearing. They moved slowly, weighed down by enormous rucksacks, and appeared to be arguing about something. As they drew closer, I could make out details. An older couple, probably in their 60s, dressed in what looked like army surplus gear that had seen better days. The woman was rail thin, her gray hair wild and unkempt, held back by a tie-dyed bandana. Her eyes, magnified by thick glasses, darted around our campsite with unsettling intensity. The man was her opposite, broad and heavy-set, with a beard that reached halfway down his chest. He wore an ancient military jacket covered in patches and pins, and atop his head sat the most bizarre hat I'd ever seen, like a fishing hat that had been attacked by a craft store. They stopped when they saw me watching them. "Morning," the woman called out, her voice high and reedy. "Didn't expect to find anyone else here." By now the commotion had woken the others. Heads began emerging from tents like curious meerkats. Powell was the last to appear, and when he did, I saw all the color drain from his face. "Mr. Hemley," I said, the recognition hitting me like a slap. "Is that you?" The man's face split into a grin that didn't reach his eyes. Well, one of my former students. What are the odds?" Graham Hemley had been my art teacher for 4 years at Thornfield Secondary. He'd been one of those teachers that students either loved or hated, no middle ground. I'd been firmly in the love camp, spending countless lunch hours in his classroom, working on projects and listening to his stories about his younger days as a traveling artist. He'd left suddenly during my GCSE year. One day he was there, the next we had a supply teacher who became permanent. No explanation, no goodbye. Just gone. "This is Krishna," he said, gesturing to the woman beside him. She gave us a little wave, her movements bird-like and quick. "We're doing a tour of all the old camping spots from my youth." Cheggers and Sammy recognized him too, gathering around with surprised exclamations. Only Powell hung back, and when I glanced at him, he was staring at Hemley with an expression of pure loathing. I'll go get more firewood," Powell muttered, and before anyone could respond, he'd stalked off into the trees. "Bit early for that, isn't it?" Hemley called after him, but Powell was already gone. We helped them set up their tent, a moldy-looking thing that probably hadn't been aired out since the 1970s. Krishna kept up a constant stream of chatter about ley lines and energy vortexes, while Hemley watched us work with that same unsettling grin. "So how did you know about this place?" Cheggers asked as we hammered in the last tent peg. "Oh, I've been coming here for decades," Hemley said. "Long before you boys discovered it. Used to bring friends here, for gatherings." Something about the way he said gatherings made my skin crawl. "In fact," he continued, "I was here just last month. Used your fire pit, hope you don't mind. Very well constructed." That explained the signs of recent use, but not the smell. Up close, I realized it was coming from them. A mixture of unwashed bodies, stale smoke, and something chemical I couldn't identify. "We should do breakfast," Sammy suggested, ever the peacemaker. "You're welcome to join us." "How kind," Krishna said, her magnified eyes fixing on me. "We'd love that." The day passed in a blur of forced politeness. Hemley regaled us with stories from his teaching days, carefully avoiding any mention of why he'd left. Krishna disappeared for hours at a time, returning with bags of mushrooms and plants she'd foraged, lecturing us about their properties in exhausting detail. Powell didn't return until late afternoon. When he finally emerged from the woods, sweaty and scratched from bushwhacking through undergrowth, he took one look at Hemley still holding court by our fire, and immediately announced he was going for a swim in the stream. "I'll come with you," I offered, but he shook his head sharply. Need some alone time, he said, and there was something in his voice that stopped me from arguing. As evening approached, we started preparing dinner. Hemley and Krishna hadn't contributed any food, I noticed, but they hovered around our camp stove like hungry ghosts. The smell from their direction had gotten worse, a cloying chemical stink that made my eyes water. You lads fancy getting a bit enlightened tonight? Hemley asked suddenly, producing a collection of small plastic bags from his jacket pocket. My blood went cold. The bags contained pills, tabs of what looked like LSD, and an enormous quantity of dried mushrooms. Just picked these today, Krishna said, holding up the mushrooms. It was obviously a lie. They were professionally dried and packaged. No thanks, I said quickly. We're good with beer. Oh, come on. Hemley's voice took on a wheedling tone. Don't be so pedestrian. When I was your age, we understood the importance of expanding consciousness. Cheggers, always curious, leaned forward. What kind of mushrooms are those? Liberty caps, Krishna said, then caught herself. Well, mostly. Some others mixed in, all perfectly safe. Define safe, Brody muttered. Hemley's grin widened. Safe is relative, isn't it? But I guarantee you'll have an experience you'll never forget. I'll stick to weed, thanks, Cheggers said. Got any of that? Hemley's expression soured slightly, but he produced a small bag of cannabis. This is quite strong, he warned. Not your usual student rubbish. He wasn't wrong. After just a few drags of the joint he reluctantly shared, I felt my head spinning. The smoke tasted wrong, chemical and harsh. Cheggers took a huge drag and immediately started coughing. Bloody hell, he gasped. What's in this? Oh, just some herbs mixed in, Krishna said vaguely, for enhancement. By now, Sammy and Brody had retreated to their tents, citing early morning headaches. Powell was still nowhere to be seen. That left just me and Cheggers with the increasingly insistent couple. How about some tea? Hemley suggested, already filling our kettle with stream water. Mushroom tea is much gentler than eating them raw. We're fine, I insisted, but he was already adding handfuls of mushrooms to the boiling water. The smell that arose was earthy and somehow wrong, like soil from a grave. Just try a sip, Krishna urged, her hand suddenly on my shoulder. Her fingers were cold even through my jacket. It'll help with the cannabis effects. Cheggers, clearly more affected by the doctored joint than I was, grabbed a mug before I could stop him. Why not? He slurred and downed half of it in one go. The change was almost immediate. His pupils dilated until his eyes were almost black, and he stood up abruptly, swaying. I can see them, he whispered. In the trees. They're watching us. Who's watching us? I asked, alarmed. The little people, he said, then laughed, a high, unhinged sound. They're everywhere. He stumbled off toward the tree line, arms outstretched like he was trying to embrace something invisible. Shouldn't someone go after him? I asked. He'll be fine, Hemley assured me. First time can be intense. Here, have some tea. It'll help you understand what he's experiencing. The mug was thrust into my hands. Up close, I could see things floating in the murky liquid, not just mushroom pieces, but other plant matter I couldn't identify. Hemley and Krishna watched me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I'm good, I said, setting the mug down. Don't be rude. Krishna's voice hardened. We're sharing our sacred medicine with you. Drink, Hemley commanded, and there was something in his tone that transported me back to being 14 in his classroom, desperate for approval. I pretended to sip, keeping my lips closed. The liquid was hot against my mouth, and even that brief contact made my lips tingle unpleasantly. More, Hemley urged. You need a proper dose. They pressed closer, and I realized with growing panic that I was trapped between them and the fire. In the distance, I could hear cheggers crashing through the underbrush, shouting about fairies. The next hour exists in my memory as fragments, puzzle pieces that don't quite fit together. The small amount of tea that had touched my lips, combined with whatever had been in that joint, was enough to alter my perception. The forest around us seemed to pulse and breathe, the trees leaning in to listen to our conversation. Hemley's face kept shifting in the firelight, his features stretching and distorting. He was telling a story about a commune he'd lived on in Wales during the 1960s, but his words seemed to come from very far away. Complete freedom, he was saying. No boundaries, no shame. We understood that society's rules were just constructs designed to control us. Krishna had moved behind me, her hands on my shoulders again, rubbing in circular motions that made my skin crawl. "You have such tense energy," she murmured. "You need to release it." "I'm fine," I managed, trying to pull away, but my limbs felt heavy and uncooperative. "You know what would help?" Hemley leaned in close and I could smell his breath, sour and chemical. "Skin-to-skin contact with the earth. We should all get sky-clad." "Sky what?" "Nude," Krishna clarified, her hands moving down my arms. "It's the natural state. Nothing to be ashamed of." Warning bells were screaming in my head, but they seemed muffled, like they were coming from underwater. I tried to stand, but Hemley's hand pressed down on my shoulder, keeping me in place. "Relax," he said, but his grin had taken on a predatory quality. "We're all friends here. In fact, I remember you being quite talented in my class. Such a creative boy. I always notice the creative ones." Something about that phrase cut through the fog in my brain. I'd heard rumors after he left, whispers about why he'd really gone, about complaints from students. I'd dismissed them at the time, not wanting to believe ill of my favorite teacher. "I need to check on Cheggers," I said, trying again to stand. "He's fine," Krishna insisted. "But you're not. You're fighting the medicine. Here, take this." She tried to push a pill between my lips. I turned my head away, but Hemley grabbed my chin, forcing me to face him. "Don't be difficult," he said, his voice hard now. "We're trying to help you evolve." That's when I saw Powell. He stood at the edge of the firelight, a massive branch in his hands, his face twisted with rage. He looked like something out of a nightmare, or perhaps in my altered state like an avenging angel. "Get your hands off him," Powell said, his voice deadly calm. Hemley released my chin, turning to face Powell with that same unsettling grin. "Ah, the runaway returns. Still having your little tantrums, I see," I said. Powell took a step closer, hefting the branch. "Get away from him." "Or what?" Hemley stood, spreading his arms wide. "You'll hit a teacher? Still the same violent little boy who couldn't control his temper." Powell's face went white, then red. "I was 12 years old, you sick bastard." The words hung in the air like a physical presence. Suddenly, horribly, everything made sense. Powell's reaction to seeing Hemley, his refusal to be alone with him, the way Hemley kept needling him about his temper. Now, Hemley said, his tone patronizing. "No need for name-calling. We both know nothing inappropriate happened. You always did have an overactive imagination." That's when Powell snapped. The branch came down on Hemley's tent with a crack like thunder. The ancient fabric split apart, poles snapping like matchsticks. Krishna screamed, a high, piercing sound that seemed to go on forever. "You want to drug my friends?" Powell brought the branch down again, this time on their camping gear. "You want to do to them what you tried to do to me?" Hemley scrambled backward, all pretense of calm gone. "You're insane. Krishna, call the police." "With what signal?" Powell laughed, but there was no humor in it. We're 20 miles from nowhere, you piece of garbage. He advanced on Hemley, who was now pressed against a tree, hands raised defensively. Krishna tried to grab Powell's arm, but he shrugged her off like she weighed nothing. You know what you did, Powell said, his voice breaking. That weekend trip to Marsden Farm, you came into the showers every night. You made those comments. You tried to. I was checking on the students, Hemley protested. It was my responsibility. You were a predator, Powell roared. And when I finally told my parents, when they went to the school, you disappeared. But not before you'd done the same to 3 other kids in my year. My head was clearing now, adrenaline burning through whatever drugs were in my system. I stood on shaky legs, moving to stand beside Powell. Is that true? I asked Hemley. His silence was answer enough. Get out, Powell said quietly. Pack what you can carry and get out. If I see you near my friends again, if I ever see you near any young people again, I'll do worse than break your tent. Hemley's mask finally slipped completely. The genial art teacher was gone, replaced by something nasty and cornered. You can't prove anything, he spat. It's your word against mine, just like before. Maybe, Powell agreed. But right now, it's my branch against your skull. Your choice. Krishna was already gathering their things, shoving items randomly into bags. Graham, let's just go, she pleaded. These aren't the right energies. Listen to your girlfriend, I advised, finding my voice. Leave now, and we won't follow you to your car to make sure you actually go. It took them 20 minutes to pack what they could salvage. 20 minutes of Powell standing guard with his branch while I went to check on Cheggers, passed out in a pile of leaves muttering about gnomes, and wake Sammy and Brody. As they prepared to leave, Hemley turned back one last time. You always were an uptight little prig, he told Powell. No wonder you needed extra attention. Powell raised the branch, and Hemley quickly turned away, following Krishna into the darkness. We waited a full hour before Powell finally lowered his weapon. Then he sat down hard by the fire and put his head in his hands. The rest of the night passed in a blur of revelations and recriminations. Powell told us everything, how Hemley had targeted him during that school trip, the inappropriate touching disguised as checking on him, the comments about his developing body, how he'd been too scared and ashamed to tell anyone for months, and how when he finally did, the school had quietly encouraged Hemley to resign rather than face a proper investigation. There were others, Powell said, staring into the dying fire. Jamie Northwood, Eric Tam, Ben Cross, all of us in the special education program. He thought we were easy targets because some of us had learning difficulties. Thought we wouldn't be believed. God, Powell, I said, feeling sick. I'm so sorry I had no idea. Why would you? He shrugged. He was careful. Never did anything to the mainstream kids, the ones with involved parents and good grades. Just us problem children. Sammy and Brody sat in stunned silence. We'd all had Hemley as a teacher, all thought he was one of the good ones. The betrayal felt like a physical wound. As dawn broke, Cheggers finally stirred from his mushroom-induced stupor. We told him everything while forcing water and bread into him, trying to counteract whatever he'd ingested. Should we call the police? Brody asked. Powell shook his head. And say what? That our old teacher tried to drug us. They'd say we invited it, buying weed off him. And everything else, it's all historical. My word against his, like he said. We packed up that morning in near silence. The clearing that had been our sanctuary for years now felt tainted, poisoned by what had happened there. As we hiked back to the car, I kept expecting to see Hemley and Krishna lurking behind trees, waiting for another chance. But the forest was empty, except for us. The drive home was subdued. Powell sat in the front again, but this time his posture was relaxed, like a weight had been lifted. About halfway back, he finally spoke. Thank you, he said simply, for believing me. for not asking why I didn't warn you about him. You shouldn't have had to deal with that alone, Cheggers said, hands tight on the steering wheel. We're your mates. We should have known something was wrong. You couldn't have known, Powell replied. I've gotten very good at hiding it. But seeing him again, seeing him trying the same grooming techniques on you lot, I couldn't let it happen again. We never went back to that clearing. Our camping trips continued, but we found new places, made new memories. Powell got therapy, finally dealing with trauma he'd carried for almost a decade. I looked up Hemley recently. He's in his 80s now, living in some retirement community in Devon. Krishna, whose real name turned out to be Jennifer Weatherby, died in 2021. There were never any formal charges, no justice in the legal sense. But sometimes I think about that night in the woods, about Powell standing there with his branch like some ancient warrior protecting his tribe. Sometimes justice doesn't come from courtrooms or police stations. Sometimes it comes from friends who refuse to let evil repeat itself, who stand up and say, no more. The clearing is probably still there, slowly being reclaimed by the forest. I hope no one else finds it. Some places should be left to rot, along with the memories of what happened there. But the lesson remains. Evil can wear familiar faces, trusted faces. And sometimes the people we least expect to be heroes are the ones who save us when we need it most. That's why I'm telling this story now, years later. Because somewhere out there might be another group of friends, another isolated place, another predator wearing the mask of mentorship. And maybe, just maybe, reading this will help someone recognize the danger signs before it's too late. Or maybe it will help someone like Powell, carrying silent trauma, watching for signs of danger others can't see, know that their vigilance matters, that protecting others from what happened to them is a form of heroism that deserves recognition. The monsters in our stories aren't always strangers in dark alleys. Sometimes they're people we trusted, people who were supposed to guide and protect us. But here's the thing about monsters. They're only powerful when we're alone. When we stand together, when we believe each other, when we refuse to let shame and fear silence us, they become what they really are. Pathetic. Aging predators who rely on our isolation to survive. Powell saved us that night, but in a way we saved each other. And that bond, forged in fear and solidified in truth, is stronger than any drug, any manipulation, any attempt to reclaim power over us. Some things, once broken, can't be fixed. Trust, innocence, the ability to see certain people as purely good. These are casualties of knowledge. But from those breaks can grow something stronger. Vigilance without paranoia, protection without overreach, and the ironclad certainty that we will not let it happen again. Not on our watch. Not to our people. Never again. You know that sense of excitement when you finally take your RV out after a long work week? Yeah, that's the feeling I had driving up to Raven's Gorge, a secluded spot in the Montana wilderness. This wasn't my first time RV camping, but it was definitely the first time I chose to do it solo. My wife, Emma, and our kids, Liam and Zoe, had other plans, so I figured why not have a little adventure of my own? The campsite at Raven's Gorge was everything an outdoor enthusiast could dream of. Towering pines, the sound of a distant stream, and an eerie quietness that made you feel like the only person in the world. I parked my RV in a clearing, surrounded by trees, their branches arching over like a cathedral roof. As I set up camp, I couldn't shake the feeling that eyes were watching me from the dense forest. I tried to brush it off as just my imagination running wild. Setting up was quick, and soon enough I had my fire going. The familiar crackle bringing a sense of comfort. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with hues of orange and purple, I sat back in my folding chair, letting the tranquility sink in. The shadows lengthened, stretching across the clearing like grasping fingers. A cool breeze rustled through the trees, carrying with it the faint scent of decay. Now, I'm not a paranoid guy, but there was something about that place that made me uneasy. Maybe it was the isolation, or the way the wind seemed to whisper through the trees. Still, I tried to brush it off as the typical jitters of being alone in the wild. As darkness fell, the forest came alive with nocturnal sounds, the hoot of an owl, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, and something else. A sound I couldn't quite place, like the muffled whimper of a child. I shook my head, telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. I decided to turn in for the night, securing the RV and making sure everything was locked up tight. The fire was dying down, and the chill in the air was getting more pronounced. I crawled into my bed, the comforting hum of the RV's heater lulling me to sleep. I woke up in the middle of the night to a strange noise, a sort of rustling sound. At first, I thought it might be a deer or some other animal, but as I listened closer, it became evident that whatever was making the noise was much closer and far too deliberate to be an animal. My heart started pounding, but I tried to stay calm, reminding myself that I was just being paranoid. The noise grew louder, moving around the RV, scraping against the metal. It sounded like long, sharp nails dragging across the surface. I reached for the baseball bat I kept by the bed, call it a precaution, and tiptoed towards the door. My palms were sweaty, gripping the bat tightly. I felt like a character in one of those cheesy horror movies, but this was no movie. This was real, and the fear coursing through my veins was all too tangible. Peeking through the small window, I couldn't see anything but darkness. The moonlight was weak, barely illuminating the clearing. Taking a deep breath, I decided to step outside, bat at the ready. As soon as I opened the door, the cold air hit me, and my breath formed a cloud in front of me. The rustling stopped abruptly, leaving an unsettling silence. I scanned the area, my eyes struggling to adjust to the darkness. That's when I saw it, a shadow moving swiftly between the trees. It was too fast for me to make out any details, but it was definitely not human. Its movements were fluid yet unnatural, like nothing I'd ever seen before. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice sounding braver than I felt. No response. The shadow seemed to have disappeared, leaving me standing there like an idiot, bat in hand, heart racing. I went back inside, locking the door behind me. Sleep was out of the question now. I sat in the driver's seat, bat across my lap, keeping watch through the windshield. Hours passed, and the forest remained silent, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Just as the first light of dawn began to creep in, I must have dozed off because I woke up to the sound of footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps approaching the RV. I jolted awake, grabbing the bat again, and moved to the door. The footsteps stopped just outside. I could hear someone, or something, breathing, the sound too close for comfort. My heart pounded in my chest as I flung the door open, ready to confront whatever was out there. Standing before me was a figure, tall and gaunt, with a face that looked like it was made of bark and leaves. Its eyes glowed with an otherworldly green light, and where its mouth should have been, there was only a dark, gaping hole. In its hand, it held what looked like a crude spear made from a sharpened branch. "What do you want?" I demanded, trying to keep my voice steady. It didn't respond, just stared at me with those glowing eyes, the spear twitching in its grip. I tightened my hold on the bat, ready to defend myself. The creature took a step forward, and instinct kicked in. I swung the bat, aiming for its head, but it was quick. It dodged, and the spear came slashing towards me. I managed to deflect it with the bat, but the force knocked me off balance. The creature lunged again, and this time I wasn't so lucky. The spear grazed my arm, leaving a burning sensation in its wake. I swung wildly, catching it on the side of its head. It stumbled back, a strange, thick liquid oozing from the wound. "Stay back!" I yelled, adrenaline pumping through me. But it wasn't done. It came at me again, more ferocious this time. We struggled, the bat and spear clashing in a deadly dance. It managed to pin me against the side of the RV, the spear pressing dangerously close to my throat. In a desperate move, I brought my knee up into its midsection. It let out an inhuman screech, its grip loosening just enough for me to push it off. With all my strength, I swung the bat one last time, connecting with its head. There was a sickening crack, and the creature crumpled to the ground, the spear slipping from its hand. I stood there, panting, blood dripping from my arm, staring at the creature's motionless body. To my horror, it began to disintegrate before my eyes, turning into leaves and twigs that were quickly carried away by the wind. Shaken to my core, I stumbled back into the RV, grabbing my first aid kit to tend to my wound. It wasn't deep, but it burned like fire, and strange, root-like patterns were spreading from the cut. Panic set in as I realized this was far beyond my understanding. I needed help, and fast. I tried to start the RV, but the engine sputtered and died. Looking out the windshield, I saw that the clearing was now surrounded by a thick, unnatural fog. The trees seemed to have closed in, their branches reaching towards the RV like gnarled hands. In the distance, I could hear more of those inhuman screeches. My mind raced, trying to figure out a plan. I was trapped in this nightmare, with no way to call for help and no idea what I was up against. As the fog crept closer and the screeches grew louder, I realized that my solo adventure had turned into a fight for survival. And as the first of many dark shapes emerged from the mist, I gripped my bat tightly, knowing that the real horror was just beginning. As the first of many dark shapes emerged from the mist, I gripped my bat tightly, knowing that the real horror was just beginning. The creatures swarmed around the RV, their twisted forms a nightmarish blend of plant and animal. I could hear them scratching at the metal, searching for a way in. My mind raced, trying to figure out a way out of this hellish situation. That's when I remembered I had a flare gun in the emergency kit. With shaking hands, I retrieved the flare gun and loaded it. The scratching intensified, and I could see the door beginning to buckle under the assault. It was now or never. I flung open the door and fired the flare into the sky. The bright red light illuminated the clearing, revealing dozens of the creatures surrounding me. They recoiled from the sudden burst of light, giving me a moment's reprieve. In that brief window of opportunity, I made a mad dash for the tree line. I could hear them pursuing me, their inhuman shrieks echoing through the forest. Branches whipped at my face as I ran, my lungs burning with each breath. I had no idea where I was going, only that I needed to put as much distance between myself and those things as possible. As I ran, the forest around me seemed to come alive. Roots rose from the ground, trying to trip me. Vines reached out, attempting to ensnare me. It was as if the entire forest was working with the creatures to trap me. The wound on my arm throbbed, the strange root-like patterns now spreading across my chest. Just when I thought I couldn't run any further, I burst through the tree line and found myself at the edge of a cliff. Below, I could see the lights of a small town, civilization, safety. But it was at least 100 feet down, with no clear path to descend. The shrieks were getting closer. I turned to see the creatures emerging from the forest, their glowing eyes fixed on me. I was trapped between them and the cliff. As they advanced, I noticed something peculiar. They were keeping their distance from a particular plant growing near the cliff's edge, a patch of white flowers that seemed to glow in the moonlight. In a desperate move, I lunged for the flowers, grabbing a handful. To my amazement, the creatures recoiled, shrieking in what sounded like pain. Emboldened, I waved the flowers at them, and they retreated further. I had found their weakness. But my relief was short-lived. The ground beneath my feet began to crumble. The cliff edge, weakened by the creature's pursuit and my own weight, was giving way. In a heart-stopping moment, I felt myself falling, the world spinning around me as I plummeted towards the forest below. I crashed through branches, each impact sending waves of pain through my body. By some miracle, the dense foliage slowed my fall. I hit the ground hard. The wind knocked out of me, but I was alive. Battered, bruised, but alive. As I lay there, struggling to breathe, I heard the sound of voices and saw flashlight beams cutting through the darkness. Human voices. A search party had been sent out after seeing the flare. I called out weakly, and soon I was surrounded by concerned faces. Park rangers, locals, all looking at me with a mix of relief and confusion. They rushed me to the local hospital, where I spent the next week recovering from my injuries. The doctors were baffled by the root-like patterns on my skin, which faded over time. I tried to tell them about the creatures, about the living forest, but they dismissed it as hallucinations brought on by a toxic plant I must have come into contact with. As I recovered, I learned that Raven's Gorge had a history of strange disappearances and unexplained phenomena. The locals spoke in hushed tones about the forest folk and the dangers of venturing too deep into the woods. Most dismissed these as local legends, but I knew the truth. When I was finally well enough to leave, I found my RV had been towed back to town. Everything was as I had left it, except for a small white flower I found pressed between the pages of my map book. A chilling reminder that what I experienced was all too real. The drive home was a blur. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that somehow a piece of that forest had followed me. When I finally reached my house, I broke down in Emma's arms, the full weight of my experience crashing down on me. In the months that followed, I struggled with nightmares and a newfound fear of the woods. I couldn't bring myself to go camping again, much to my family's confusion. The root-like scars on my arms served as a constant reminder of my ordeal. I've since learned to cope, but I'll never forget what happened at Raven's Gorge. Sometimes, on quiet nights, I swear I can hear distant, inhuman shrieks carried on the wind. And when I look out into my backyard, I can't help but wonder, are the trees watching me? One thing's for certain, I'll never take a solo camping trip again. Some parts of nature, it seems, are better left undisturbed. And some stories, well, some stories are better left untold. But I've told mine now, and I can only hope that it serves as a warning to others who might think to venture into the deep, dark woods alone. Because out there, in the shadows of the ancient trees, something waits. Something that defies explanation. Something that hungers. And if you're not careful, you might just become another legend whispered around campfires on dark nights. I've always believed in the power of nature to heal. It's why I became a park ranger in the first place. There's something about the deep woods that's both calming and grounding. When you spend enough time among the pines, away from the hum of civilization, you start to hear the whispers of the trees, the rustle of life that's so much bigger than anything we experience in our daily grind. But not all whispers are kind. My name is Ethan Winters, and this is my story. A story I've kept buried deep within me for years, afraid that speaking it aloud would somehow make it more real. But the weight of silence has become too heavy to bear, and I find myself compelled to share what happened in Blackwood Forest all those years ago. It was the fall of 2012 when I was stationed in a remote part of northern Vermont, overseeing a section of forest that most folks have never heard of. Blackwood Forest was a place of untamed beauty, with towering hemlocks that blocked out the sun and hidden lakes that only the most determined hikers could find. My post was a small cabin, equipped with a radio, a wood stove, and not much else. That was how I liked it. Simple and isolated. The cabin sat at the edge of a clearing, surrounded by a sea of green that stretched as far as the eye could see. In the mornings, mist would roll in from the nearby lake, shrouding the trees in an ethereal veil. It was peaceful, serene, and for the first few months it felt like paradise. I spent my days patrolling the trails, assisting the occasional lost hiker, and maintaining the delicate balance between preservation and public access. The nights were filled with the soft hooting of owls and the distant howl of coyotes. It was everything I had ever wanted in a job. But as the leaves began to turn and the air grew crisp with the promise of winter, something changed. It was subtle at first, barely noticeable. A feeling of unease that crept in with the evening shadows, a sense that I was being watched even when I knew I was alone. The trouble began when I started hearing about the disappearances. They were just rumors at first. A hiker didn't return to his car. A couple never showed up at the trailhead where they were supposed to meet friends. The local sheriff, a gruff man named Bill Hawkins, chalked it up to poor planning or folks getting lost. But I knew these woods better than anyone. People didn't just vanish around here, not without a trace. It wasn't until I met Sarah Lawson that I started to take the rumors seriously. Sarah was a seasoned hiker, one of those people who could navigate the woods with just a map and a compass. She'd been coming to Blackwood for years, always sticking to the same trails, always signing in at the ranger station before heading out. When Sarah didn't check back in, I knew something was wrong. I was the one who found her camp, or what was left of it. Her tent was still pitched, her gear neatly arranged, but there was no sign of Sarah. No tracks, no sign of a struggle. Nothing. Just the tent flapping in the wind and an uneasy silence that seemed to press down on me from all sides. I radioed Sheriff Hawkins and a search party was assembled. We combed the area for days, but Sarah was gone. It was as if the woods had swallowed her whole. The sheriff eventually called off the search, saying that if Sarah wanted to disappear, these woods would be the place to do it. But I wasn't convinced. Sarah wasn't the kind of person to just walk away from her life. A week later, I found myself sitting in my cabin, staring at the radio, wondering what the hell had happened. That's when the first knock came. It was late, probably close to midnight. I wasn't expecting anyone, especially not at that hour. The knock was soft, almost hesitant, like whoever was out there wasn't sure they wanted to be heard. I grabbed my flashlight and opened the door, half expecting to see some lost hiker or maybe a deer that had wandered too close to the cabin. But there was no one there. I shone the light around, trying to catch a glimpse of anything unusual, but all I saw were the trees and the dense darkness beyond them. The knock came again, this time from the back of the cabin. I spun around, heart pounding, but when I reached the back door, there was nothing. I'd be lying if I said I wasn't scared. It's one thing to be alone in the woods. It's another to feel like something is watching you, toying with you. I locked the doors and windows, stoked the fire in the stove, and tried to convince myself it was just the wind playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. Sleep didn't come easy that night. I tossed and turned, my mind replaying the events of the past few weeks. The disappearances, the eerie silence in the woods, the knocking. It all felt connected somehow, like pieces of a puzzle I couldn't quite solve. When dawn finally broke, I made a decision. I was going to find out what was happening in Blackwood Forest, no matter what it took. The next morning, I decided to do some investigating of my own. I started by retracing Sarah's steps, trying to piece together what might have happened. The woods were quiet, almost too quiet, and I found myself glancing over my shoulder more than once. I wasn't sure what I was looking for. A clue, a sign, anything that might explain what had happened. It wasn't long before I found the footprints. They were faint, almost imperceptible in the damp earth, but they were there, leading away from Sarah's camp and deeper into the woods. I followed them for what felt like hours, my breath coming in short, shallow bursts as I pushed through the underbrush. The trees closed in around me, their branches scratching at my arms and face, but I kept going. The footprints led to a clearing, one that I hadn't seen before. It was small, barely big enough to be called a clearing at all, with a large flat rock in the center. The air was heavy, thick with the scent of moss and decay. And there, sitting on the rock, was a figure, He was an old man, at least from what I could tell. His clothes were tattered, his hair a wild tangle of white, and his eyes were like nothing I'd ever seen before. They were black, not just dark, but completely devoid of light, like two empty sockets staring back at me. I froze, my mind racing as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. He didn't move, didn't speak, just sat there staring at me with those hollow eyes. "Sarah?" I finally managed to say, though I knew even as the word left my mouth that this wasn't Sarah. The old man didn't respond. He just kept staring, his gaze piercing through me, making me feel like I was being torn apart from the inside. And then, without a word, he stood up and walked into the trees, disappearing into the shadows as if he'd never been there at all. I don't remember how long I stood there, staring at the spot where he'd vanished. My legs felt like they were made of lead, my mind numb with shock. Eventually, I forced myself to move, stumbling back the way I'd come, trying to convince myself that I hadn't just seen what I thought I'd seen. But the nightmares started that night. They were vivid, horrifying dreams that left me drenched in sweat, my heart racing as I jolted awake in the middle of the night. In every dream, the old man was there, watching me with those empty eyes, his presence suffocating, inescapable. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was trying to tell me something important, but the words wouldn't come. I kept to the trails after that, avoiding the deeper parts of the woods where I'd found the footprints. But it didn't matter. The whispers followed me, growing louder, more insistent. The woods, once my sanctuary, had become a place of dread. And then, another hiker went missing. This time it was a young man named Mike Chen, an experienced outdoorsman who'd come to the park for some solitude. He'd been seen on the trails by other hikers, but like Sarah, he never made it back to his car. Sheriff Hawkins organized another search party, and once again, I found myself combing through the woods, this time with a team of volunteers. We found Mike's campsite, just like we'd found Sarah's, untouched, as if he'd simply walked away in the middle of the night. But there was something else this time, something that made my blood run cold. Scratched into the bark of a tree near his tent were words, barely legible, as if they'd been carved in a hurry. "He sees you." Sheriff Hawkins dismissed it as a prank, but I knew better. I recognized the handwriting. It was the same jagged, uneven script I'd seen in my dreams, the same message the old man had been trying to convey. That night I didn't go back to the cabin. I couldn't. Instead, I drove into town and booked a room at the only motel I could find. I didn't sleep. I just sat there, staring at the door, waiting for the knock that I knew would come. And it did. It was the same soft, hesitant knock I'd heard before, but this time it was closer, more insistent. I didn't move, didn't even breathe. The knock came again, followed by a low, rasping voice that seemed to echo in my head. "You can't hide." I don't know how long I sat there, frozen in fear. The knocking eventually stopped, but the voice lingered, whispering in the back of my mind. I wanted to believe it was all in my head, that the stress of the past few weeks had finally gotten to me. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. I wasn't the only one hearing the whispers. Over the next few days, I started to notice a change in the other rangers. They were on edge, jittery, like they were hearing things too. One of them, a guy named Tom, confided in me that he'd seen something in the woods. A figure, just out of the corner of his eye, watching him from the trees. "It's like he's always there," Tom said, his voice trembling. "No matter where I go, I can feel him watching." I wanted to tell Tom to get out, to leave the park and never look back. But I couldn't. I was trapped too, caught in a web of fear and uncertainty. The disappearances continued, one after another, and each time Sheriff Hawkins found an excuse, a reason to explain why people were vanishing without a trace. But I knew better. It all came to a head one night, about a month after Sarah disappeared. I was out on patrol, walking the trails as I'd done 1,000 times before, when I heard it. The voice, clear and sharp, cutting through the stillness of the night. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The voice was faint, distant, but unmistakable. It was Sarah. Without thinking, I plunged into the trees, crashing through the underbrush as I followed the sound. The forest seemed to close in around me, the darkness swallowing the beam of my flashlight. "Help me!" The voice grew louder, more desperate, and I quickened my pace, ignoring the branches that whipped at my face, the roots that tried to trip me up. I could feel him just ahead, waiting for me. And then, I was there. The clearing was just as I remembered it, the flat rock in the center, the air thick with decay. But this time, the old man wasn't alone. Sarah was there, standing beside him, her face pale and drawn, her eyes wide with terror. "Help me," she whispered again, her voice barely audible. I took a step forward, but the old man raised a hand, stopping me in my tracks. His eyes locked onto mine, and I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. He was smiling, a twisted, cruel smile that sent a shiver down my spine. "You can't save her," the old man said, his voice cold and devoid of emotion. "She's mine now." I wanted to move, to do something, anything, but I was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by fear. The old man took a step forward, his smile widening, and I realized with a sickening jolt that he wasn't old at all. His skin was smooth, his hair dark and glossy, his eyes, those eyes were alive with malice. He reached out, his hand hovering just inches from my face, and I felt a coldness seep into my bones, a coldness that threatened to consume me. "You're next," he whispered, his breath like ice on my skin. And then he was gone. Sarah with him. I don't remember how I got out of the woods that night. The next thing I knew, I was back in my cabin, the door locked, the windows boarded up. The nightmares came every night after that, each one worse than the last, until I could barely tell where the dreams ended and reality began. I quit the job a few days later, packed up my things, and left without a word to anyone. I couldn't stay, not after what I'd seen, not after what I knew was still out there, waiting. I moved to the city, tried to start a new life, but the whispers followed me. They're always there, just at the edge of my hearing, reminding me that I'll never be free. I've tried to forget, tried to convince myself that it was all just a bad dream, but I can't. Because every night I see his face, those empty eyes staring back at me, and I know that one day he'll come for me too. And when he does, there'll be no one left to tell my story. But maybe, just maybe, by writing this down, by sharing what happened in Blackwood Forest, I can warn others. Keep them away from that cursed place. Because the whispers are real, and they're waiting for anyone who dares to listen. So if you ever find yourself in the deep woods and you hear a whisper on the wind or see a figure just out of the corner of your eye, don't stop. Don't listen. Just run. Run as fast and as far as you can. Because in Blackwood Forest, the trees have eyes and the shadows have teeth. And they're always hungry for more. It's been years since I left Blackwood Forest, but the memories still haunt me. I've tried to move on, to build a new life, but the whispers never truly fade. They're there in the rustle of leaves on a windy day, in the creak of floorboards in the middle of the night. I've done my research since then, digging into the history of Blackwood Forest. What I found chilled me to the bone. The disappearances go back decades, maybe even centuries. Native American legends speak of a dark spirit that dwells in the woods, a being that feeds on fear and despair. I've reached out to others who've had similar experiences, people who've encountered the entity in different forests across the country. We're few and far between, and most are reluctant to speak about what they've seen. but the pattern is clear. Something ancient and malevolent is out there, moving from forest to forest, leaving a trail of vanished souls in its wake. Sometimes late at night I think I see him. A glimpse of that ageless face in a passing reflection. Those hollow eyes staring back at me from the shadows. And I wonder, did I ever really escape? Or am I just living on borrowed time, waiting for the day when he decides to claim me for good? I don't know if anyone will believe this story. Hell, there are days when I'm not sure I believe it myself. But I know what I saw in Blackwood Forest. I know what's out there, waiting in the dark. So this is my warning to you, dear reader. The next time you're in the woods and you feel that prickle on the back of your neck, that sense that you're being watched, trust your instincts. Because in the deepest, darkest parts of the forest, where the sunlight never quite reaches the ground, there are things that defy explanation, things that hunger, things that wait, and they're always listening for the next unwary soul to wander into their domain. Stay safe. Stay vigilant. And whatever you do, don't listen to the whispers. Because once you do, it might already be too late. I never thought I'd be the kind of person to tell a horror story. Before that summer at Cedar Creek Camp, my life was almost comically ordinary. My name is Richard Brown, and back in 2015, I was just another 28-year-old freelance graphic designer in New Orleans, spending my days crafting logos and websites for small businesses while dreaming of bigger things. Nature had always been my escape. Growing up in Louisiana, I'd spent countless weekends exploring the bayous with my dad, learning to read the water and weather, understanding the subtle language of the wilderness. As an adult, hiking became my meditation. Whenever a project deadline left me stressed or client revisions piled up, I'd drive out to the state parks, lose myself in the trails, and come back renewed. That's probably why Travis's suggestion about the summer camp caught my attention. Travis Henderson had been my best friend since college. A lanky, perpetually optimistic social worker with a talent for convincing people to step outside their comfort zones. We'd met in a programming class where neither of us belonged, bonding over our mutual confusion and eventually dropping the course together. He had this way of making terrible ideas sound perfectly reasonable, which is exactly what happened when he pitched the idea of volunteering at Cedar Creek. "Come on, Rich," he'd said over beers at our usual spot, the Rusty Nail. "A week in the Ozarks, fresh air, no screens, no clients. Maya's already on board." Maya Chen, his girlfriend of 2 years, was an elementary school teacher with endless patience and a dry sense of humor that balanced Travis's enthusiastic optimism. They were perfect together, and I'd grown to consider her as much a friend as Travis. "I did it last summer," Travis continued, "and it was incredible. The kids are great, the scenery is beautiful, and Mr. Caldwell, the camp director, he's like this wise old mountain man who knows everything about the forest." He took a sip of his beer, grinning. "Plus, you've been talking about wanting to explore Arkansas." He wasn't wrong. I'd never been to Arkansas, and the idea of spending a week in the Ozarks had its appeal. My current project was wrapping up, and the summer heat in New Orleans was becoming unbearable. Maybe a change of scenery was exactly what I needed. "What would we actually be doing?" I asked, already knowing I was going to say yes. "Basic counselor stuff, leading hikes, supervising activities, teaching some outdoor skills. Nothing too crazy." Travis leaned back, victory written all over his face. "Maya's handling the arts and crafts. You could do nature photography with the kids. Put those fancy camera skills to use." A week later, we were packed into Travis's ancient Jeep Cherokee, heading north on I-55. The vehicle's air conditioning barely worked, but the windows-down drive through the Mississippi Delta and into the Ozark foothills felt like the beginning of an adventure. Maya had made a playlist of classic road trip songs, and Travis kept us entertained with increasingly implausible stories about his previous summer at the camp. None of us could have known that this would be the last normal moment we'd share. That in just a few days, our simple summer adventure would transform into something dark and terrifying. That we'd find ourselves caught up in a mystery that would haunt us long after we left Cedar Creek behind. Looking back now, I can see the signs we missed. The way Mr. Caldwell's smile never quite reached his eyes when he greeted us. The strange silence that fell over the forest at night. The warnings written in the nervous glances exchanged by the local staff. But hindsight has a way of making everything clearer, doesn't it? In the moment, we were just three friends starting what we thought would be a fun week away from the city. I've told this story a few times since then, usually late at night, usually after a few drinks when someone asks about the worst thing I've ever experienced. Each time, I see the same skepticism in their eyes that I would have had before that summer. But I tell it anyway because people need to know that sometimes the strangest, most terrifying things happen in the most ordinary places. That evil can wear a friendly face, and that the darkness doesn't always hide in the shadows. Sometimes it walks right beside us in broad daylight. This is the story of what happened at Cedar Creek Camp in the summer of 2015. Some of the names have been changed to protect privacy, and there are parts I still struggle to explain. But every word is true. I know, because I lived it. And not a day goes by that I don't think about those kids, that cabin, and the horrible secrets we uncovered in the woods. Cedar Creek Camp sat nestled in a valley between two ridges of the Ozark Mountains, about 30 miles from the nearest town of any size. From the moment we pulled into the gravel parking lot, I could tell this place was different from the summer camps I'd seen in movies. There were no cheerful welcome banners, no crowds of excited kids running around. Instead, a heavy stillness hung in the air, broken only by the sound of wind in the tall pines and the distant call of birds I couldn't identify. Mr. Caldwell met us at the main lodge, a sprawling log building that looked like it had been standing since the Great Depression. He was tall and lean, with weather-beaten skin and eyes that seemed to catch every detail. The limp in his walk suggested an old injury, but he moved with the deliberate grace of someone who knew every inch of these grounds. "Welcome to Cedar Creek," he said, his handshake firm but quick. "Travis, good to have you back. And you must be Richard and Maya." He gestured toward the lodge. "Let's get you settled in. Orientation starts in an hour." The inside of the lodge was cool and dim, with mounted deer heads on the walls and a massive stone fireplace dominating one end of the main room. As Mr. Caldwell led us through the building, pointing out the dining hall, infirmary, and staff quarters, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Maybe it was the way his voice tightened when he mentioned certain areas of the camp, or how he kept glancing out the windows at the surrounding forest. During orientation, we met the other counselors. Sarah, a college student studying biology, Mike and Jenny, a married couple who'd been working at the camp for 3 summers, and David, a quiet guy about my age who taught high school science during the year. They all seemed friendly enough, but I noticed they avoided talking about anything that had happened at the camp before this summer. The next few days were filled with training sessions on everything from first aid to camp protocols. Mr. Caldwell was particularly emphatic about the buddy system. No one, not even staff, was to go anywhere alone. "The forest can be disorienting," he explained. "People have gotten lost out there." Something in his tone made me wonder if he was talking about more than just temporary disorientation. We learned about the camp's history, or at least the sanitized version Mr. Caldwell shared. Cedar Creek had opened in the 1960s as a traditional summer camp, closed for a few years in the mid-70s for renovations, and reopened under Mr. Caldwell's leadership in the early 1980s. When Travis tried to ask about the closure, Mr. Caldwell smoothly changed the subject. The kids were due to arrive on Sunday, giving us 2 more days to prepare. I spent that time exploring the grounds with Travis and Maya, getting to know the trails we'd be using, and setting up the photography equipment I'd brought for my activities. The camp was beautiful in a wild, untamed way. Ancient oaks and pines towered overhead, their branches creating a canopy that turned the forest floor into a perpetual twilight. A creek, the camp's namesake, wound through the property, its clear water flowing over rocks worn smooth by time. But even then, there were moments that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Times when the birdsong would suddenly stop, leaving an unnatural silence in its wake. Places where the undergrowth seemed too thick, too dark, hiding whatever lay beyond from view. Once, while checking out the hiking trails, I could have sworn I saw movement in the trees, something large and quick, gone before I could focus on it. "Did you see that?" I asked Travis, but he was busy consulting the trail map. "See what?" I shook my head. "Nothing, just shadows probably." Maya gave me a strange look. "You know, some of the local kids say these woods are haunted. Old Cherokee burial grounds or something." Travis laughed. "Every forest in America is supposedly built on burial grounds. It's just stories to scare the campers." But I noticed Maya didn't laugh with him. Instead, she wrapped her arms around herself, as if suddenly cold, despite the summer heat. The night before the kids arrived, we had a final staff meeting in the lodge. Mr. Caldwell went over the week's schedule one last time, emphasizing safety procedures and emergency protocols. As he spoke, a storm rolled in from the mountains, thunder echoing off the ridges. "One last thing," he said, his voice barely audible over the rain now hammering the roof. "If any of you notice anything unusual during your time here, anything that doesn't feel right, you come to me immediately. Don't investigate on your own. Don't mention it to the kids. Just come to me." We all nodded, though I saw Travis and Maya exchange a look. Later, as we walked back to our cabins through the rain, Travis pulled me aside. "Look, there's something I should tell you about this place," he started. But before he could continue, a massive thunderclap shook the ground, and all the lights in the camp went out at once. In that moment of total darkness, I heard something moving in the woods beyond the cabins. Something big. And then, just at the edge of hearing, what sounded like children laughing. But that was impossible. The kids weren't arriving until tomorrow. The next morning dawned clear and humid, the storm's only remnants being puddles that dotted the grounds and a lingering heaviness in the air. The kids arrived in waves, yellow buses winding up the gravel road, disgorging excited children into the organized chaos of check-in. Among them was Ethan Walker, a quiet 12-year-old with watchful eyes, and a worn paperback tucked into his back pocket. I was assigned to Cabin 7, which included Ethan and 5 other boys around his age. During the first few days, we fell into a rhythm. Mornings were filled with activities. My photography sessions, Maya's crafts, swimming in the lake under Jenny's supervision. The kids seemed to be having fun, though I noticed Ethan often hung back from the group, watching the tree line with an intensity that seemed beyond his years. The 4th day started like any other. After breakfast, Travis and I were scheduled to lead a hike to Cedar Falls, one of the camp's highlights. The trail wound through old-growth forest, following the creek upstream to where it cascaded over a series of rocky shelves. It was supposed to be a simple 4-hour round trip. We gathered our group, 12 kids, including Ethan and a girl named Lily Martinez, who'd become something of a leader among the younger campers. The morning was unusually still, the forest quiet except for the occasional distant woodpecker. As we started up the trail, I noticed Mr. Caldwell watching us from the lodge porch, his face tight with worry. The first mile was easy going. Travis led the way, keeping the kids entertained with jokes and trail facts. I brought up the rear, making sure no one fell behind. The forest around us was beautiful but oppressive, ancient trees crowding out the sky, their branches intertwining overhead to create a green twilight even at midday. About halfway to the falls, Ethan dropped back to walk beside me. "Mr. Brown," he said quietly, "did you hear about the missing kids?" "What missing kids?" I asked, though something in his tone made my stomach tighten. "From before, in the 70s. He glanced around before continuing. "My dad was a camper here back then. He said 3 kids disappeared in these woods. They never found them." Before I could respond, Travis called out from ahead, "Keep up, guys. Falls are just around the bend." But when we reached the spot where the fall should have been, Travis stopped short. Instead of following the main trail, he was studying a narrow path that branched off to the right, disappearing into a particularly dense section of forest. "That's weird," he muttered. "This wasn't here last summer." Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe something else was guiding us, but we decided to explore the new trail. It was rougher than the main path, barely more than a game trail winding between the trees. The air grew noticeably colder as we walked, and the forest sounds seemed to fade away until all we could hear was our own breathing and footsteps. After about 10 minutes, the trail opened into a small clearing. In the center stood the remains of an old cabin, its roof partially collapsed, windows dark and empty. But it was what lay scattered around the cabin that made my blood run cold. Dozens of small items spread across the ground. A faded baseball cap, a single tennis shoe, a friendship bracelet like the ones Maya had been teaching the kids to make. "Mr. Brown?" Lily's voice was barely a whisper. "These look like—" "Everyone back to the main trail," Travis ordered, his usual cheerfulness gone. "Now." But as we turned to leave, I saw Ethan staring at something near the cabin's foundation. Before I could stop him, he walked over and picked up a small object. It was a book, the same paperback he'd been carrying when he arrived at camp, but this copy was weathered and aged, its pages yellow with time. "That's impossible," Ethan said, his voice shaking. "This is my book, but it looks—" A twig snapped in the forest behind us, and every head turned toward the sound. There, at the edge of the clearing, stood a figure. It was roughly human-shaped, but wrong somehow. Too tall, too thin, its proportions subtly distorted. For a moment, it remained perfectly still, as if studying us. Then it moved. What happened next was chaos. The kids scattered, screaming. Travis shouted for them to stay together, but panic had already taken hold. I grabbed Ethan and Lily, the 2 nearest to me, and pushed them toward what I hoped was the direction of the main trail. We ran blindly through the undergrowth, branches whipping at our faces. Behind us, I could hear something moving through the forest, not crashing or rushing, but moving with a terrible purpose, as if it knew exactly where we were going and was simply waiting for us to tire. "The cabin!" Ethan gasped between breaths. "The old cabin by the lake. We can hide there." It was better than running aimlessly. We changed direction, Ethan somehow seeming to know the way despite the confusion. The thing in the forest changed direction with us, matching our new course with eerie precision. When we finally broke through the trees at the lake's edge, I saw the cabin Ethan had mentioned, the same one Travis had talked about earlier. It looked abandoned, but right then, any shelter seemed better than being in the open. We burst through the door and I slammed it behind us, for all the good that would do. The cabin's interior was a single room, dusty and cold despite the summer heat outside. But what caught my attention was the trap door in the floor, partially hidden under an old rug. We had barely caught our breath when we heard it. A soft scratching at the cabin walls, moving slowly around the perimeter. Lily whimpered, and I pulled both kids close, trying to think of a way out of this nightmare. The scratching stopped at the door. For several heartbeats, nothing happened. Then the door began to open, slowly, revealing the thing that had chased us. In the dim light filtering through the cabin's grimy windows, I could finally see it clearly. It wore the shape of a man, but like a costume that didn't quite fit. Its limbs were too long, joints bending in impossible ways. Its face was smooth and featureless except for eyes that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. But what struck me most was its stillness. Even as it stood there blocking our only exit, it remained unnaturally motionless, as if it were a photograph of movement rather than movement itself. Then Ethan did something I'll never forget. He stepped forward, holding out the weathered copy of his book like a shield. "You took them, didn't you?" His voice was surprisingly steady. "The other kids. The ones like me." The creature's head tilted at an angle that made my stomach turn. When it spoke, its voice was like dry leaves scratching against stone. "They were lonely, like you. I gave them a home." "No," Ethan said. "You took them from their homes, like you were going to take me." The thing moved then, faster than seemed possible, reaching for Ethan with fingers that were too long, too sharp. But before it could touch him, the trapdoor burst open. Mr. Caldwell emerged from below, holding what looked like an ancient rifle. Behind him came Travis and Maya, both looking terrified but determined. The creature whirled toward them with that same impossible speed. "Not this time," Mr. Caldwell said, and fired. The shot seemed to echo forever in the confined space of the cabin. The creature jerked backward, more in surprise than pain, I think. Then it began to change, its form rippling like heat waves over asphalt. The air filled with a high-pitched keening sound that made my teeth ache. "The symbols!" Mr. Caldwell shouted. "Maya now!" Maya began chanting something in a language I didn't recognize, while Travis rushed forward to grab Ethan and Lily. Through the windows, I could see strange lights beginning to dance in the forest, weaving between the trees like fireflies. The creature was becoming less solid now, its edges blurring into the shadows. It reached out one last time, those two long fingers stretching toward Ethan, but Maya's chanting reached a crescendo, and suddenly the cabin was filled with a blinding light. When my vision cleared, the creature was gone. The cabin was silent except for our heavy breathing and the distant sound of sirens. The official story was that a former counselor had been living in the woods, trying to abduct children. The police found evidence in the underground room beneath the cabin. Old photographs, personal items taken from previous victims, detailed plans for future abductions. They said we were lucky to have stopped him before he could take any more kids. But we knew the truth. We had seen something that didn't fit into any rational explanation, something that had been haunting Cedar Creek for decades. Mr. Caldwell finally told us the full story, about how he'd lost his own brother to the creature in 1974, how he'd spent years researching the old legends and protective symbols that could ward it off, how he'd reopened the camp hoping to prevent more disappearances. The camp closed permanently after that summer. The official reason was structural problems with the buildings, but those of us who were there knew better. Sometimes late at night, I still dream about that clearing in the woods, about the thing that wore a human shape like an ill-fitting suit, about the look in Ethan's eyes when he confronted it. I've stayed in touch with Travis and Maya over the years. They got married last spring, though neither of them can look at forests the same way anymore. Maya threw herself into researching similar incidents across the country. There are more than you'd think, if you know where to look. Ethan writes to me sometimes. He's in college now, studying folklore and anthropology. His experiences at Cedar Creek shaped him, but not in the way the creature intended. He's determined to understand what happened, to prevent it from happening to others. As for me, I moved away from New Orleans, took a job in Chicago, where the most dangerous thing I have to worry about is rush hour traffic. But every summer, when the days grow long and the shadows deep, I think about Cedar Creek, about the things that hide in the dark places of the world, wearing faces that almost look human. Last month, I received a package from Mr. Caldwell. Inside was Ethan's weathered paperback, the one we found in the clearing. With it was a note. Some doors, once opened, can never be fully closed. I keep the book locked in a drawer now, but sometimes, late at night, I swear I can hear pages turning. And in my dreams, I still see those eyes that swallowed light. Still hear that voice like dead leaves whispering about loneliness and belonging. The creature at Cedar Creek taught me something important. Not all monsters hide in shadows. Sometimes they stand in plain sight, wearing shapes we almost recognize, speaking words we almost understand. And sometimes the most terrifying thing isn't the monster itself, but the realization that part of you understands why lonely children might follow it into the dark. I don't go hiking anymore. The trails hold too many memories, too many shadows that might not be shadows at all. But I keep that book as a reminder of what we discovered in those woods, of the fine line between reality and nightmare, and of the stories we tell ourselves about what really lives in the dark places of the world. Because sometimes the strangest, most terrifying stories are the ones that are true. I never wanted to be the guy with the crazy story. You know the type. The one at parties who corners you with wild tales that couldn't possibly be true. But here I am, 38 years later, still haunted by what happened in those woods. My hands shake every time I tell this story, but it needs to be told. Maybe then someone else can avoid what I experienced. I wasn't always like this, jumping at shadows and checking locks twice before bed. Back in '86, I was your typical Chicago advertising executive, climbing the corporate ladder with the rest of them. Worked at Jensen and Mills, one of those agencies where creativity meant finding new ways to sell toothpaste. I had a comfortable life, a downtown apartment, season tickets to Cubs games, and enough disposable income to fund my real passion, hiking and nature photography. That's what really got me through those endless client meetings and late nights at the office, planning my next wilderness adventure. I'd been an outdoorsman since I was a kid, learning the basics from my father on camping trips in Wisconsin. By my 30s, I'd hiked most of the major trails in the Midwest and was always looking for more remote, challenging locations. I had a well-worn copy of America's Hidden Trails that I'd mark up with possible destinations, dreaming of places where you could still find true solitude. My friends thought I was crazy. Why camp when you can afford hotels? They'd ask. But there was something about being out there, away from the artificial light and concrete, that made me feel alive. I'd made quite a few friends on the trails over the years. Other solo hikers who understood the call of the wild. We'd swap stories around campfires, share trail maps, and warn each other about dangerous spots. Those connections, brief as they were, felt more real than any networking event in Chicago. But by June 1986, the stress was getting to me. Our agency had landed a major automotive account, and my boss, Richard Kenner, was writing me hard about deadlines. Kenner was one of those micromanagers who'd send memos at 3 a.m. and expect immediate responses. After 3 months of 7-day weeks and missed social events, I was burning out. The final straw came when he killed my best campaign concept in front of the entire creative team. That night, I went home and started planning my escape. I needed somewhere off the grid, away from fax machines and phone calls. Looking through my trail guides, I found a mention of Kelly Creek in northern Idaho. The book described it as a pristine fishing stream in the heart of the Clearwater National Forest, accessible only by dirt roads and seldom visited. Perfect. I had 2 weeks of vacation saved up, and my old RV, a '78 Winnebago Brave with wood paneling and questionable gas mileage, was ready for another adventure. I told Kenner I was taking time off for a family emergency. He wasn't happy, but I didn't care anymore. I needed this break. What I didn't know then was that this wouldn't be the relaxing retreat I'd planned. Instead, it would become the beginning of a nightmare that would follow me for the rest of my life. The drive from Chicago to Idaho took 3 days. I took my time, enjoying the gradual transition from flat Midwestern farmland to the rugged terrain of the Mountain West. My RV might have been old, but it was comfortable. I'd modified it for extended trips, adding solar panels and a better water filtration system. The back was loaded with everything I thought I'd need: my fishing gear, hiking equipment, enough food for 2 weeks, and emergency supplies. I'd done my research on Kelly Creek. The area was known for its cutthroat trout, and the remote location meant the fish hadn't been pressured much by other anglers. The guidebook warned about the rough access road and mentioned there were no facilities, just primitive camping spots along the creek. It also noted that black bears were common in the area, so I made sure to pack bear spray and a bear-proof food container. What the guidebook didn't mention was the local legends. I learned about those later in the Pierce Sheriff's Office when it was already too late. The locals had stories about that part of the forest, stories about hunters who went missing and hikers who came back changed. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I arrived at Kelly Creek on June 14, 1986. The access road was worse than I expected. 5 miles of rutted dirt that had my RV creaking in protest. But when I finally reached the creek, I knew the drive had been worth it. The water was crystal clear, flowing through a valley flanked by dense pine forest. Mountains rose in the distance, their peaks still holding patches of snow. The air smelled of pine needles and wild mint. I found a good spot to park the RV, about 50 yards from the creek. There was a flat area for a campfire and enough room to set up my chair and fishing gear. As I was getting settled, I noticed another RV further downstream, an older model than mine, with faded blue stripes along the side. I wasn't disappointed to have company. In places this remote, it was actually comforting to know there was another person around if something went wrong. That's when I met Mark Hadley. He walked up as I was unpacking, carrying 2 beers and wearing a friendly smile. He was older than me, probably in his late 40s, with gray starting to show in his beard. His golden retriever, Max, trotted alongside him, tail wagging. Mark offered me a beer and introduced himself as a regular visitor to Kelly Creek. He had a cabin a few miles away but preferred camping by the water during the summer months. We sat and talked as the sun set behind the mountains. Mark was easy to talk to, the kind of person who makes you feel like you've known them for years. We discussed fishing spots, compared notes on our favorite trails, and commiserated about the sorry state of the Cubs that season. Max lay at our feet, occasionally lifting his head when he heard something moving in the brush. Looking back now, I wish I'd paid more attention to Max's behavior that first evening. Dogs have better instincts than we do, and Max seemed unusually alert, his ears constantly twitching toward the dark tree line. But I was too caught up in the conversation and the beer to notice. Mark told me about the best fishing spots upstream, and we made plans to try them out the next day. As night fell and the temperature dropped, we said our goodnights. I watched Mark and Max head back to their campsite, their figures gradually swallowed by the darkness. The creek's gentle burbling and the occasional hoot of an owl were the only sounds. It felt peaceful then. God, how quickly that would change. The next few days fell into a pleasant routine. I'd wake up early, make coffee on my portable stove, and head to the creek with my fishing gear. Mark would usually join me, and we'd spend the morning trying different spots along the water. He knew what he was talking about. Following his advice, I caught several beautiful cutthroat trout, including one that must have been at least 18 inches long. The landscape was stunning in the morning light. Mist would rise from the creek, creating ethereal shapes that danced between the trees. The forest was thick with lodgepole pines and western red cedars, their branches creating a canopy that filtered the sunlight into shifting patterns on the ground. Wild columbines and Indian paintbrush added splashes of color to the undergrowth. We'd break for lunch, sharing stories and trading fishing tips. Mark had been coming to Kelly Creek for over 20 years, and he knew every bend in the stream. He told me about the changes he'd seen, how the forest fires in '67 had altered the landscape, and how the fish populations had recovered after some bad years in the '70s. But there were times when he'd get quiet, especially when talking about the deeper parts of the forest. I noticed other things too, small details that didn't seem significant at the time. Max never wandered far from Mark, which was unusual for a retriever. And sometimes, while we were fishing, the dog would suddenly stop and stare into the trees, his hackles rising slightly. Mark would call him back, and the moment would pass. But there was tension in those moments that I couldn't explain. On our fourth day there, we decided to explore one of the tributary streams that fed into Kelly Creek. Mark knew of a series of pools about a mile upstream that he said held some monster trout. The trail was faint, clearly not used much, and we had to push through thick undergrowth in places. The forest felt different here, darker, more primitive somehow. The trees grew closer together, their branches intertwining overhead to block most of the sunlight. As we hiked, I started noticing things that seemed off. There were areas where the vegetation had been crushed, as if something large had moved through recently. We found scratches on some of the trees, too high up to have been made by a bear. Mark saw me looking at them and quickly suggested we try a different spot, but I caught the worry in his voice. The atmosphere had changed. The friendly banter that had marked our previous days was replaced by long stretches of silence, broken only by the sound of our boots on the trail and Max's panting. The air felt heavier, more oppressive, and there was a smell I couldn't quite identify, something musty and organic, like rotting vegetation, but with an underlying sweetness that made my stomach turn. We reached the pools Mark had mentioned, but neither of us felt much like fishing anymore. The water was dark and still, reflecting the twisted branches overhead like a black mirror. Max stayed close to Mark's legs, occasionally whining softly. We made some half-hearted attempts to cast our lines, but our hearts weren't in it. Something about this place felt wrong. That's when we heard it. A sound that didn't belong in these woods. It was like a cross between a wolf's howl and something else. Something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, echoing through the trees. Max began to growl, a low, continuous sound I hadn't heard from him before. Mark's face had gone pale. "We should head back," he said quietly, already reeling in his line. I didn't argue. We packed up quickly, our movements jerky and rushed. The sound came again, closer this time, and Max's growl turned into a whimper. We practically ran back down the trail, no longer caring about the branches that whipped at our faces or the roots that threatened to trip us. By the time we reached our campsite, the sun was setting, casting long shadows through the trees. We built a fire larger than usual that night, and neither of us strayed far from its light. Our conversation was sporadic and tense, both of us trying to pretend we hadn't experienced what we had. Mark kept glancing into the darkness beyond the firelight, and Max stayed pressed against his leg, trembling slightly. That night, in my RV, I lay awake listening to the sounds of the forest. The usual nighttime noises, crickets, owls, the rustle of small animals, seemed somehow wrong, as if they were being performed by something trying to imitate natural sounds but not quite getting it right. I told myself I was being paranoid, that the isolation was getting to me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something out there was watching, waiting. I didn't know it then, but this was just the beginning. The real horror was still to come, and nothing, not my years of outdoor experience, not Mark's knowledge of the area, not even Max's protective instincts, would be enough to save us from what lurked in those woods. The next day started normally enough, but there was an undercurrent of tension neither of us could shake. Mark suggested we stick close to camp, focus on fishing the main creek. I agreed, relieved he didn't want to venture back to those dark pools. We spent the morning catching a few smaller trout, our conversation sparse and distracted. Around mid-afternoon, I decided to gather more firewood. The day was warm, but we'd been burning through our supply quickly, keeping the fires bigger and burning longer into the night. I stayed within sight of the creek, working my way along the tree line. That's when I found the first sign that something was seriously wrong. It was a deer carcass, or what was left of one. I've seen plenty of animal kills in my years of hiking. Bears, mountain lions, wolves. But this was different. The carcass wasn't just torn apart. It was arranged. The bones had been carefully positioned in a pattern I couldn't quite comprehend, like some twisted art installation. The skull was missing, but the spine and ribs formed a spiral pattern on the forest floor. There was no scent of decay, despite the obvious age of the bones, and no signs of scavengers. I called Mark over. He took one look at the arrangement and turned away, his face ashen. "We need to leave," he said quietly. "Both of us. Today." But before we could discuss it further, Max started barking frantically from back at the campsite. We ran back, abandoning the firewood. The campsite had been ransacked. But not in the way bears sometimes tear through camps looking for food. This was methodical. Everything had been removed from both RVs and arranged in geometric patterns on the ground. Our food, clothes, fishing gear, all laid out in concentric circles. In the center was Mark's family photo, taken from inside his RV, torn into precise triangular pieces. We should have left right then. Should have jumped in our RVs and never looked back. But Mark's satellite radio was missing, the only way to call for help this far out, and he was convinced it must be somewhere in the arranged items. As we searched through our scattered belongings, the sun began to set, far too quickly for mid-afternoon. That's when we started hearing the whispers. They seemed to come from just behind the trees, voices speaking in a language that sounded almost familiar but wasn't quite right. Max's barking had turned to whimpers, and he pressed himself against Mark's legs, trembling. We saw the first shadow figure dart between the trees, tall and impossibly thin, moving with a jerky, insect-like motion. Then another, and another. They stayed just at the edge of our vision, never quite fully visible. The whispers grew louder, and I began to make out words in English scattered among the strange language. Hungry, and stay, and forever. Mark grabbed his rifle from the scattered gear, and I found my flashlight. The shadows were getting closer, more bold. They left strange footprints in the dirt. Not animal tracks, not human prints, but something that seemed to change shape between glimpses. The attack, when it came, was swift and terrible. One moment we were standing back to back, scanning the tree line, and the next, the thing was among us. I got my first clear look at it, and my mind still struggles to process what I saw. It was tall, at least 9 feet, with limbs that bent in too many places. Its skin was a patchwork of bark-like plates and something that looked like stretched leather. The head was the worst part. A crown of antlers sprouted from a face that seemed to shift between human and animal features, never settling on one form. Max lunged at the creature, his loyal nature overcoming his fear. The thing moved with impossible speed, swatting the dog aside like a toy. Mark fired his rifle, the sound deafening in the confined space. The creature screamed, a sound that made my teeth vibrate and my vision blur, but it didn't fall. Instead, it seemed to grow larger, feeding off the violence. "Run!" Mark shouted, reloading. "Get to your RV! Go!" I hesitated for a split second, and that hesitation haunts me. In that moment, the creature struck, its arm elongating like a whip, claws extending. Mark was lifted off his feet, still firing. The rifle's muzzle flash illuminated the scene in strobing bursts. Mark struggling, the creature's face splitting into what might have been a smile, Max lying motionless on the ground. I ran. God help me, I ran. Behind me, Mark's screams turned into something else, something that didn't sound human anymore. I reached my RV, fumbled with the keys, practically fell inside. The engine started on the first try, the only piece of luck I had that day. As I threw it into reverse, I saw the creature standing in my headlights. It still held something that might have been Mark, but I couldn't look too closely. Its face seemed to be trying to mirror my own expression of terror, like a child learning about emotions. I drove backward until I hit a tree, then threw the RV into drive and floored it. The access road was a nightmare of ruts and washouts, but I barely noticed. Branches whipped against the windows, and something kept pace with me in the darkness beside the road. I drove all the way to Pierce without stopping, without looking back. The sheriff's office was an old brick building on the town's main street. I burst in, babbling about monsters and missing people. Sheriff Richards was a solid, grounding presence. He listened without interruption, then gathered a search party. By the time we got back to Kelly Creek, dawn was breaking. The official report listed it as an animal attack. They found Mark's body, what was left of it, and poor Max. The RV was still there, but all our scattered belongings had vanished. The deer skeleton was gone too, leaving no evidence of the strangeness I'd witnessed. They found tracks, but the official explanation was unidentified large predator, possibly grizzly. I stayed in Pierce for a week while they investigated. The locals were kind but distant. Some of them wanted to talk, late at night at the town's only bar. They had stories, generations of stories about things in those woods. About how the original logging operations in the area had stopped after entire crews vanished. About hunters who came back changed, if they came back at all. The nightmares started immediately and never really stopped. I'd wake up screaming, convinced that stretched leather face was peering in my window. I moved out of my Chicago apartment because the fire escape outside my window cast shadows that looked like elongated limbs. I couldn't handle being alone in natural settings anymore, which meant giving up the hiking and camping I'd loved. I became obsessed with researching similar incidents. I found patterns, stories scattered across the Northwest about impossible creatures, about missing hikers and arranged bones. I talked to cryptozoologists, folklore experts, even a professor of Norse mythology who had interesting theories about entities called Jotun, giants that could change their shape. 5 years after my experience, I got a letter from Mark's daughter. She'd been going through his cabin and found his journals. He'd been studying the thing in the woods for years, documenting its patterns, its hunting grounds. He knew what it was, but couldn't stay away. The last entry, dated the day before I met him, read, "It's changing its tactics, learning, adapting. God help anyone it decides to study." 38 years have passed since that night at Kelly Creek. I'm an old man now, retired from advertising, living in a small apartment in Seattle. I still can't sleep without lights on, still jump at unexpected shadows. I've been in therapy, tried medication, moved across the country, but I can't escape the memory of what I saw. I'm writing this now because I've been diagnosed with terminal cancer. I've got maybe 6 months left, and I need people to know the truth. Last week I received a package. No return address, no note. Inside was Mark's torn family photo, the pieces arranged in exactly the same pattern as that day in the woods. Sometimes, late at night, I think about what Mark wrote, about the creature learning, studying. I wonder if it let me escape that night. If it wanted a witness, someone to spread the story, to attract more curious souls to its hunting ground. And I wonder, looking at that photo, if it's finally finished studying me. So this is my warning. Stay away from Kelly Creek. If you're hiking in the northern forests and you find bones arranged in patterns, run. And if you meet a friendly stranger in the woods, someone who seems to know the area well and wants to show you the hidden places, remember Mark Hadley. Remember that some things in this world are ancient and patient, and they're learning our ways. They're always learning.